Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and chairman, Helga Zepp LaRouche. It's April 28th, and this has been a week of very significant events. I want to start by calling the viewers' attention to a new class series that was begun last night by Helga Zepp LaRouche, taking up the question of the individual can change history, which is an in-depth look at the life and work of Lyndon LaRouche. And I would encourage people to go to LaRouchePAC and look at that, because everything we're going to discuss in this webcast has been affected and shaped by the lifelong work of Lyndon LaRouche. Now, with that said, one of the points of the important developments of the week was the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. This was a very large event, extremely significant. Don't be fooled by the lack of coverage generally in the Western press, other than to demean it. It included many nations. And Helga, what was your assessment of how this event went, the second Belt and Road Forum?
Oh, I think it was a great success. It is completely consolidated. This is a new dimension to the world economy, which exists even if the Western media pretend it doesn't exist or attacks it for no good reason. 37 heads of state participated, 600 ministers from, I think, 130 countries, then 5,000 participants, delegates, 100 heads of international organizations, and many side arrangements, bilateral summits, altogether 64 billion worth of new economic agreements of one kind or another. So I think this was quite a big success. And Xi Jinping, in his keynote speech, indeed went in great detail through the great progress which was made in the last 2 years since the first Belt and Road Forum. And then he listed a long list of corridors and projects, which I don't even try to replicate here. It's about 20, 30 large corridors. And he named as the first one, which naturally made me very happy, the new Eurasian Land-bridge. Now, as people may know, this is something we have been campaigning for almost 30 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think this is a completely, next very big phase in the new Silk Road becoming the world land bridge. And, I think also extremely significant is that in the context of this Belt and Road Forum, which the United States only sent some diplomatic representation, but not a high-ranking government person, there were several renewed offers by the US ambassador in the United States, Sui Tiankai, but also Global Times. They had several articles inviting the United States to join, and basically saying the US should not sit by. The US economic industrial potential is urgently needed for these kinds of global development projects. So the hand is clearly stretched out from the side of the Chinese, and one can only hope that there will be a rethinking on the side of the United States.
I was very struck by the open appeal by Sui Tiankai, the ambassador from China to the United States, where he said, imagine if the United States and China, the two most dynamic economies in the world, were to work together. It was an open appeal, and hopefully there are people in Washington who are thinking it through. Now, clearly, Helga, one of the things that I was struck by was the participation from Europe, from Switzerland, from Greece, from Italy, from Serbia, and I understand even Germany sent Altmaier there. This is really beginning to blossom inside Europe, and obviously this is going to be a problem for the European Union bureaucrats who are trying to shut it down.
Well, before I get into the European situation, I should just mention that at the beginning of my presentation in this class you mentioned, I showed a beautiful video of my husband from 1997, where he talks about the need for the United States to engage in the Eurasian Land-bridge. And he says the two most important countries are the United States and China to work together. And when you look at that video, you think it would have been for the occasion of the Belt and Road Forum. That's how absolutely actual it is. So please take a look at this incredible video of Mr. LaRouche. Now, the Europeans, this was very, very interesting because there were several heads of state, for example, Tsipras from Greece. He emphasized in his speech that with the development of the port of Piraeus, Greece is now becoming the hub and the gateway for the trade from Asia through the Suez Canal into the Balkans, into Europe. And he said Greece is not a border between the south and the north, but a bridge. So even more enthusiastic was Prime Minister Conte from Italy, who also met with Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang. And he basically responded, or Xi Jinping emphasized very much that he is very happy with the memorandum of understanding which was signed between Italy and China at his recent visit, and both emphasized that this can be a model for all of Europe. Now, that is exactly the case. And then you had the president of Switzerland, Uli Maurer, who also made a very strong statement by saying that this New Silk Road initiative is a completely rare, long-term strategic planning which brings incredible benefits to the world. And then a spokesman of his office responded to a criticism of the EU Commission by saying, well, first of all, Switzerland is not in the EU, and secondly, we are an independent, sovereign country who can make our own decisions. And Conte, by the way, also responded to such a criticism, saying that because of the memorandum of understanding between Italy and China, that Italy has now a much better head for these kinds of policies than if they would be part of the European Union. Now, Altmaier, couldn't help himself, so he gave a speech and he emphasized the usual kind of litany, transparency, rules, and so forth, completely obviously being oblivious to the new Silk Road spirit, which was clearly present for most of the other participants. And he completely failed to take note of the fact that President Xi Jinping also had announced major measures for a continued opening up, more access to the Chinese market, more protection of intellectual property, more imports, more macro management coordination. So a lot of things which are actually steps by the Chinese to respond to these demands. And obviously, this is slowly but steadily sinking in. There was just yesterday quite an interesting article in the German economic daily Handelsblatt, which had been very critical and even hostile to the Belt and Road Initiative in the past. And they had an article saying it's completely wrong to demonize China because the recent negotiations between China and Malaysia and Sri Lanka have shown that there is complete flexibility. There is no such thing as a debt trap. And if countries which are partners of China in these projects want to renegotiate a treaty, that's absolutely no problem. And it was successful in both cases. And then they say in the end that the IMF has noted that there are 17 countries in Africa who may not be able to pay their debt, but that China is engaged in only 3 of them, but the rest of them all are indebted to the Paris Club and such big banks like Credit Suisse and so forth. So totally debunking this lie about the so-called debt trap. So I think overall this is going in a very, very good direction. And also Putin praised the Belt and Road Forum to the highest heaven, saying this will have a bright future. And he emphasized the extreme importance of the Chinese-Russian cooperation, and that there was absolutely no contradiction between the Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasian Economic Union, that they were completely integrating. So I think this is really an important development, because this creates stability in the world economic situation, which is really very, very important for the storms which sure will come soon.
I think we should see if we can get a translation of that Handelsblatt article out in Washington, because the Washington think tanks, the same networks, by the way, that pushed the Russiagate scandal against Trump, engaged in the coup against Trump, are now turning this into a Chinagate by attacking China as having imperial ambitions and so on. Now, there were some developments on the Mueller report, the Russiagate coup overall, quite significant, with Donald Trump coming very close to what you had called for, Helga, going after the British and demanding an apology. What can you say about his tweeting and the story as it's emerging about the turning the tables against the coup plotters?
Well, there was this interview which Trump gave to Fox TV, Mr. Hannity, and in that interview, he said several times that, you know, what the whole thrust of the Russiagate, that it was a coup, that it was an attempt to oust him from office, that something like that normally would only happen in a third world country, and that the worst thing about the Mueller report was that it did not mention one word about all of this. And then naturally also that he will release all the documents related to the Christopher Steele report, to the FISA court, to the relevant persons in the FBI and the Department of Justice. So this is now hanging in the air, and I do not agree. I just listened to an American commentator who said this will change absolutely nothing. I mean, the implication of this is really incredible. Now, the mainstream media has completely blocked this out. I mean, here you have a situation where the American president says that there was a coup involving the British government, and you know, there is no discussion about that. I mean, this is an unbelievable reflection of the complete Gleichschaltung, the complete control of the mainstream media on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, the only article I saw about this, maybe I missed some, but Politico had a short, relatively objective story, but there was, to my knowledge, no coverage in Europe at all. Now, that is unbelievable, but I don't think this will hold, because we had on our LaRouche webcast an interview, or basically a show which involved Barbara Boyd, Mr. Johnson, and Lawrence Johnson, and Bill Binney. And they basically, again, looked at the Mueller report and said that in the Mueller report, there is absolutely no proof about Russia meddling in the in the election or anything else, that these are just assertions, and that on the other side, the role of the GCHQ and British intelligence is what is really the most important aspect of any collusion. Now, if Trump goes ahead and releases these documents, and I think this will happen, because also in the Congress there are motions in this direction, then naturally, eventually, the role of the British will become known. And this will not just have ramifications inside the United States, but just think what it will do in Russia. The Russians really, have been targeted by the British with many operations. Russiagate was the most important one, but there were all these false flag operations in Syria, which were blamed really on Russia. Then you had the so-called Skripal affair, which was also blamed on Russia, which is in all likelihood the same kind of operation. So in Russia, this will have a big effect, but also in China, the opium wars are not forgotten. In India, where the role of British imperialism and colonialism has been raised repeatedly in the recent period by this parliamentarian Shashi Tharoor, and he even wrote a whole book about it. Then in Africa, naturally, people have a big memory about British colonialism. So this will have a big, big effect. And, I think it's really important that the truth being straightened out and this imperialism stops.
And Helga, I'd like you to go into another aspect of this, because there's still confusion in many circles about what Trump is doing, what's being done in his name. Clearly, you have a gang of neocons who have taken advantage of Russiagate and Chinagate to insert themselves and to push policies that go against what Trump has stated he's for. And for example, he's against regime change, and yet you have Pence and Pompeo and others out front insisting on regime change in Venezuela and now 3 or 4 other countries. So how should, given the potential to blow up this story around the British role and why they're doing it, that is to prevent a U.S. cooperative relationship with Russia and China, how can this get out to people around the world so they can differentiate between what Trump says he wants to do and what's being done in his name?
Well, I think, we have published quite a bit about that. Trump has repeatedly said, he wants to have good relationship with Russia. He wants to invite Xi Jinping soon to the White House, hopefully to sign a trade agreement. And, there are more and more people in the world right now who recognize that there is a big difference between Trump and many members of his cabinet. The most recent example was an interview which was given by the Iranian foreign minister to CBS TV in Face the Nation, where he answered to the accusations of Bolton and such people that Iran would be the sponsor of terrorism in the region. And he said, absolutely not. Trump should talk to his allies, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They are sponsoring terrorist organizations. And then he suggested that Trump should look at the ideology of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And he said, do they have Iranian ideology? Absolutely not. And then he said, there is a big difference between Trump and what he calls the B team, meaning Bolton, Bibi, Netanyahu, bin Salman, bin Zayed. So this B team, basically is on a completely different course. And Zarif then warned that the US is putting forces into place which could lead to an accident, and therefore the highest vigilance is required that these things don't happen in an accidental way. So I think this distinction is very important, and one can only assume that the more this coup becomes a factor in the public conscience, and the base of Trump is demanding that the investigators be investigated. I mean, I understand that Trump was at a big rally in Wisconsin yesterday. I do not yet know what he said exactly, but apparently he did mention the coup. So the more the people know it and the more people demand that this coup plotters be cleaned out, the more important it is for world peace.
And I think it's also important that people like Bill Binney, Larry Johnson, and others not only spoke at our meeting the other night, but are continuing their offensive to expose the fraud in the Mueller report that said that Russia intervened and meddled in the US election. Now, Helga, there are a few other things we need to get to. You mentioned the danger looming of a financial crisis. There are new signs of this coming from emerging markets. What can you tell us about that?
Well, in Argentina, there is a complete panic. The currency collapsed on Friday. They have now inflation rate of annually 55%. But people on the ground told us that nobody knows what will happen. The situation is completely out of control. And the likelihood that Christina Kirchner may run again for president and have a good chance of winning is absolutely there, because the people really had it with the present government. Now, there are other reports in the financial media that also Turkey and South Korea are in trouble. So we have to be very vigilant, and it just makes the point, that we have to have the new credit system, which Lyndon LaRouche has been demanding for years. We need the full package of the 4 laws: Glass-Steagall, national bank in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton, a new credit system, a new Bretton Woods system, and a crash program for fusion and space cooperation to get a massive increase in the productivity of the economy. So this is urgently still on the table. And the best way to get this going and get the kind of 4-power agreement Mr. LaRouche has also demanded for many years is that the United States would respond positively to the offer of China to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative, because that would also then give the ability to invest in the kinds of development programs which will be the only way how you can stabilize many situations around the world. One of the most urgent ones, the situation in Mexico or Central America, because there is now a new caravan has arrived in Mexico City of anywhere between 10 and 20,000 people. The Mexican government had tried not to let them in the country, but here they are. And this kind of phenomena will continue until you have real economic development to solve the problem why so many human beings are running away from hunger, epidemics, and war. So I think it makes all the more urgent the need to go into a new paradigm of international cooperation to solve these problems.
Now, part of that idea of a new paradigm was very visible in the scientific report last week about the discovery of a black hole, the photographing of a black hole. I think it's crucial for going back to this theme about the work of your husband, that one of his most important points was scientific cooperation on a global basis is absolutely essential. He put this forward with the idea of the strategic defense of Earth. You've been talking quite a bit about the importance of this photographing of the black hole. How do you see this fit in the context of this idea of international cooperation?
Well, this is one of the most exciting developments, because the Event Horizon Telescope Event Horizon Telescope organization, they work together with 8 radio telescopes, which span practically the entire sphere of the Earth. They were in Chile, in Spain, in Texas or Arizona, in the Antarctic, in various other places. And it required the integration of these 8 telescopes to basically, with the help of the rotation of the Earth, then create an image, which de facto created a virtual telescope of the sphere of the size of the Earth. And that largeness was necessary to be able to make an image of this black hole. So you could not have done that with only one country working on it, but you needed practically the whole span of the planet Earth to do it, which shows that if we want to get deeper into the secrets of the universe, then that is an absolute requirement to work together internationally in this way. Now, what they discovered is a complete game changer, because for the first time they could confirm what Einstein had predicted a long time ago, namely that there would be such phenomena like black holes in the galaxies where large masses contract so densely that basically they turn into black holes, and these black holes are objects, cosmic objects, where the gravity is so gigantic that it starts to bend very much the space-time, and that basically everything disappears in these black holes, including light, including everything. So it's like, that this is a place where the laws of the universe no longer function. And that has incredible implications. I mean, first of all, it had the mass, this black hole in the galaxy M87. This is relatively nearby. As I relatively, it's only 55 million light years away. Given the fact that we have 2 trillion galaxies, I mean, this is really all very mind-boggling. But this particular black hole has a mass of 6.5 billion times that of our sun. Now we are talking about gigantic, almost unimaginable phenomena. And what has the effect of this was that all the astrophysicists and scientists basically were completely taken aback, because this is where all the laws of physics end, and completely new questions are opening up. One scientist from Bonn, from the Max Planck Institute, said, in the future, we will talk about the time until the discovery or imaging of this black hole and the time after. This is a complete watershed. Now, I think this is a beautiful thing, not only because it again proves Einstein's the theory of general relativity to be confirmed. This happened the first time a short time ago with the gravitational waves. Now it is the imaging of the existence of a black hole. And basically scientists now assume that such a black hole is at the center of each galaxy. And as I said, 2 trillion galaxies. So this opens up a whole new realm of physics. And it just shows you, all the assumptions of the, ridiculous people like the Club of Rome, or totally uninformed people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her New Green Deal. All of these things are bunk, because obviously our universe is anti-entropic, it is expanding, and the human creativity is a material force in that universe. So all of these things I find completely exciting, and they are a challenge to the imagination of all the young people to really become serious about science again, which is an art which has been lost very much in the recent period, at least in the West, fortunately not in other places. But I find this very, very exciting, and we will talk more about it.
Helga, I think this would bring a big smile to your husband's face, as he was probably the biggest axiom buster on the planet during his lifetime. And that brings us to the question again of the importance of people coming to recognize who he was, what he did, what his method was, and why it's applicable today. And we should encourage people again to go to the Schiller Institute website, where you can find an exoneration petition. We're in the middle of a global mobilization for LaRouche's exoneration for many, many reasons, but including the importance of defeating the coup in the United States permanently, not just exposing it, but defeating it, but also to open these beautiful ideas up so that they're no longer ridiculed by a mainstream media which has no credibility. So if you'd like to say something more on this, I think this would be the right time.
Well, I'm deeply convinced that the salvation of the United States, and by implication that of the world, and the exoneration of my husband are identical questions. The one reason you mentioned, that the networks which went after him in unbelievable campaigns, Ramsey Clark once called it the worst obstruction of justice and violation of law in the United States, in the history of the United States. So that's one very big reason that these networks must be demasked and justice must be reinstalled. But as an immediate result of this or effect of this, that if people don't look at the ideas of my husband, which really represent the next level of human science and human knowledge about the laws of the universe, it's, I made in some other discussion recently the comparison to, the effect Plato had on the Italian Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance was prepared by Dante, Petrarca, by the beautiful sculptures at the churches and so on. There was a fertile ground, but it was really when Nicolaus of Cusa brought the delegation of the Greek Orthodox Church to the Council of Ferrara and Florence, and they brought the entire life work of Plato with them. That was what was the spark which caused the Italian Renaissance to completely, create a new paradigm. And, fortunately, you had the Medicis, who made this was a rich family which financed a crash program of translation. And it was really a complete a new period which started. And I'm saying that is the same in respect to the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. I think there are many good things happening in the world right now, but I'm absolutely convinced that his important life work will be the spark which will trigger a new renaissance, at least in the West, but I think also beyond. So that is why I really urge you to read his works and sign the petition for his exoneration and help us to spread it.
Okay, that's a good assignment for everyone. Helga, thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you again next week.
Till next week.